unraveling a paranormal crime scene. The walls of the abandoned house oozed a dark, sticky substance, but it wasn't blood. The smell was unbearable, a mix of rot and burnt flesh, and as Detective Harper touched the black liquid, it moved, crawling up his arm like it was alive. Before we dive into this chilling tale of darkness and secrets, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss the stories that keep you awake at night. The smell struck before Detective James Holloway even crossed the threshold. It wasn't just the pungent, sickly odor of decay. It was something deeper, something foul enough to make his stomach churn and his skin crawl. It clung to the air, a thick, invisible fog of rot and despair that seemed to seep into his pores with every breath he took. James hesitated for a moment on the doorstep, his hand gripping the peeling wooden frame of the old house. His instincts, honed over 15 years of chasing down murderers, screamed at him to turn around, to walk away. But duty called louder than fear, and he stepped inside. The house was suffocatingly silent, the kind of quiet that felt alive, like it was watching and waiting. The air was heavy with a stillness that pressed down on him, making every step feel like wading through quicksand. His boots echoed faintly on the warped wooden floorboards, the sound swallowed almost immediately by the oppressive atmosphere. The walls were yellowed with age and grime, but as he moved further into the dimly lit room, James could swear they were moving, shifting subtly, as though breathing in tandem with him. He blinked hard, shaking off the unnerving sensation, and focused on the task at hand. And then he saw it. The body hung from the ceiling like some grotesque centerpiece, nailed in place with rusted spikes that gleamed dully in the weak light filtering through cracked windows. The victim's skin had been flayed, the raw flesh beneath glistening and crimson, almost pulsating as if the body still clung to some semblance of life. The face was the worst of it, a frozen mask of horror, the mouth stretched wide in a scream that would never be heard. James's throat tightened, and he forced himself to look away, his hands trembling as he fumbled for his notepad. Below the dangling corpse, scrawled in a substance that looked like blood but smelled far worse, was a single word smeared across the floor. Confess. The letters were jagged, uneven, as if written in a frenzy, but their message was deliberate, screaming out into the silence like an accusation. James crouched down to examine it more closely, the sickly, coppery scent of the blood mingling with the stench of decay until he could barely breathe. His fingers hovered over the writing, but he didn't dare touch it. Something about it felt wrong. It wasn't just the word itself, it was the way it seemed to sink into the floor, as if the house was swallowing it whole. He stood abruptly, his head spinning. The room seemed smaller now, the walls inching closer, the shadows lengthening unnaturally. James rubbed his temples, trying to shake off the sensation. He told himself it was just the stress, just the exhaustion from years of seeing humanity at its worst. But deep down, he knew this was different. This wasn't like any other scene he'd worked. The air felt charged, humming faintly, almost imperceptibly, like a swarm of insects just out of sight. And then he realized it wasn't a hum, it was a whisper. At first, he thought it was his mind playing tricks on him. The whispers were so faint he could barely make them out, like the murmur of wind through broken windows. But as he stood there, frozen in place, they grew louder. Words began to take shape, fragmented and elusive, slipping through his grasp like smoke. They weren't coming from outside. They were coming from the walls, from the very house itself. James's chest tightened, his breath coming in shallow gasps as he tried to decipher the words. His name. He was sure of it now. They were whispering his name. James. The sound was soft, almost tender, but it cut through him like a blade. He spun around, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, illuminating nothing but the decaying furniture and peeling wallpaper. There was no one there. Of course, there was no one there. But the whispers didn't stop. They grew bolder, louder, crawling into his ears like venomous spiders. James clutched his flashlight like a weapon, his knuckles white, and took a step back toward the door. But something stopped him. A presence, invisible yet undeniable, pressing down on him like a heavy hand on his shoulder. He closed his eyes for a moment, willing the whispers to stop, but they only intensified, overlapping until they became a cacophony of voices, pleading, accusing, crying. His pulse thundered in his ears, and his stomach churned with a primal fear he couldn't shake. He opened his eyes and focused on the body again, desperate for anything to anchor him in reality. But now, the face seemed different. The eyes, hollow and lifeless just moments ago, now seemed to be staring directly at him, the mouth twisting into something resembling a smile. He stumbled back, his boot catching on the edge of the rug, sending him crashing to the floor. His flashlight rolled away, its beam flickering wildly, casting grotesque, shifting shadows across the walls. James scrambled to his feet, his heart hammering so hard it felt like it might burst. He grabbed the flashlight, his hands shaking uncontrollably, and swept it across the room again. The body hadn't moved. Of course it hadn't. It was just his mind, his exhausted, terrified mind playing tricks on him. That's what he told himself over and over as he backed toward the door. But as he reached for the handle, he heard it again. Not a whisper this time, but a voice. Low and guttural, resonating through the house like a distant earthquake. Confess. It wasn't a request. It was a command. James froze, his hand on the doorknob, unable to move. The air grew colder. The kind of cold that bit into his skin and turned his breath to fog. He turned slowly, almost against his will, and his flashlight beam landed on the word on the floor. The blood was still wet, glistening in the dim light, but now it was moving, shifting as though alive. It rose from the floor like tendrils of smoke, twisting and writhing, forming shapes that James couldn't comprehend. He staggered back, his mind teetering on the edge of collapse as the tendrils reached for him. And then, just as quickly as it had started, it stopped. The room fell silent again, the blood pooling back into its original form. But the word remained, stark and damning, burned into his vision even as he stumbled out the door, gasping for air. James didn't look back as he made his way to his car, his mind racing with questions he wasn't ready to face. The whispers still echoed in his ears, a haunting refrain he knew he wouldn't escape. This wasn't just a murder scene, it was something far worse. And deep down, he knew he wasn't done with it, not yet. Detective James Holloway turned his gaze to the slightly ajar door at the edge of the room, a portal to what could only be the basement. It stood there, half open, as if daring him to come closer. The dim light from his flashlight cast long, trembling shadows that danced across the cracked plaster walls, and yet the door seemed untouched by the light, its interior shrouded in an unnatural darkness. His feet felt rooted to the floor, his body reluctant to move toward it. But something about the way the door seemed to breathe, almost imperceptibly, pulled at him. It wasn't curiosity that drove him. It was the suffocating certainty that whatever lay beyond it was crucial to understanding the horror before him. He took a tentative step forward, the floorboards groaning under his weight, their sound unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. His flashlight flickered again, a taunting prelude to the complete darkness that threatened to engulf him. James muttered a curse under his breath, his voice thin and wavering, more to remind himself that he was still in control, or at least trying to be. With every step closer to the door, the temperature in the room seemed to plummet. The chill wasn't just physical, it was a deep, penetrating cold that seemed to seep into his very marrow, as though the house itself resented his intrusion. Reaching the door, he hesitated. The air seemed heavier here, thicker, like trying to breathe underwater. He could feel the weight of it pressing against his chest, and his fingers trembled as he pushed the door open further. It creaked, the sound sharp and grating, cutting through the silence like a scream. Beyond the door, the basement yawned open before him, a black void that seemed to stretch infinitely downward. The flashlight's beam was swallowed by the darkness, revealing only the first few steps of a narrow staircase that descended into the unknown. James gripped the wooden railing, its surface rough and splintered beneath his touch. He peered into the abyss, his heart pounding in his ears like a war drum. The air down there smelled worse, far worse, than the room above. It wasn't just decay. It was a foul, sulfuric stench that turned his stomach and made his throat tighten. His instincts screamed at him to retreat, to leave and call for backup. But something deeper, a compulsion he couldn't explain, urged him forward. He descended slowly, each step creaking ominously under his weight, as though the staircase itself disapproved of his presence. The darkness seemed alive. It pressed against him from all sides, suffocating and oppressive, as if the basement walls were closing in. His flashlight's narrow beam revealed glimpses of old, rusted pipes and cobwebs so thick they looked like shrouds. His breath fogged in the icy air, each exhale dissipating into the darkness like a dying ghost. A faint, almost imperceptible sound reached his ears, a soft, rhythmic tapping. It was distant at first, echoing faintly from the depths below, but as he descended further, it grew louder, more deliberate, like a heartbeat counting down to something inevitable. At the bottom of the stairs, the dirt floor of the basement came into view. It was uneven, damp, and littered with debris, broken tools, scraps of wood, and shards of glass that glinted like jagged teeth in the faint light. But what caught James's attention was the box. It sat in the center of the room, an old wooden chest that seemed out of place, pristine in comparison to the squalor surrounding it. The carvings on its surface were intricate, almost hypnotic, swirling patterns that seemed to shift and writhe when he tried to focus on them. James approached the box cautiously, every fiber of his being screaming at him to stop, to turn back. But he couldn't. It was as though invisible strings were pulling him forward, guiding his hands as they reached out to touch the lid. The wood was cold, unnaturally so, sending a jolt through his fingers that made him flinch. He hesitated, his breath coming in shallow gasps before finally lifting the lid. Inside were the Polaroids. The sight of them sent a chill down his spine, a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. He picked one up, his hand trembling, and examined it under the flashlight. The photo depicted a man, his face contorted in terror, his lifeless body arranged in an unnatural pose. James flipped through the pictures, each one more horrifying than the last. The victims were all different, yet their expressions were the same, wide, unblinking eyes filled with despair and agony. And then he saw the final photo. His breath caught in his throat, and the flashlight slipped from his grasp, clattering to the floor and plunging the room into near darkness. The picture showed him. He was standing in this very basement, flashlight in hand, his face frozen in the same expression of terror that marked the other victims. James staggered back, his mind reeling. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be. He fumbled to retrieve the flashlight, its beam casting wild, frantic arcs across the room. The tapping sound resumed, louder now and closer. It echoed from the walls, from the floor, from the air itself, surrounding him in a dissonant symphony of dread. James's pulse thundered in his ears as he spun around, desperate to find the source. But there was nothing, just shadows. Shadows that seemed to shift and stretch, taking on shapes that his mind refused to comprehend. And then he heard it, a voice, low and guttural like the rumble of distant thunder. It spoke a single word, reverberating through the darkness with an authority that left no room for doubt. Leave. The ground beneath his feet seemed to tremble, and the air grew colder still, the sulfuric stench now overpowering. James didn't need to be told twice. He bolted up the stairs, his flashlight bouncing wildly as he fled the basement. The door slammed shut behind him with a deafening crash, the sound echoing through the house like a gunshot. James collapsed against the wall, gasping for air, his heart hammering in his chest. The whispers had stopped, and the house was silent once more, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed him, that the shadows were watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. As he staggered toward the front door, he swore he heard it again, faint and distant, a single mocking word: confess. The front door slammed shut behind James Holloway with a finality that reverberated through his bones. The sound lingered in the icy night air, a stark reminder of the oppressive, suffocating terror he had just fled. His breath came in ragged gasps, plumes of vapor forming in the cold as his trembling hands struggled to find the keys to his car. They jingled like brittle bones in his pocket, his fingers fumbling slick with sweat despite the biting chill. The house loomed behind him, its windows dark and watchful, like hollow eyes in a decaying skull. Even with his back turned, he could feel its presence, a malevolent weight pressing against him, a silent challenge that dared him to look back. But he didn't. He couldn't. His instincts screamed at him to put as much distance as possible between himself and that cursed place. When he finally managed to unlock the car door, his movements were frantic, desperate, as though the shadows might reach out and pull him back at any moment. He threw himself into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut and locking it in one swift motion. The silence inside the car felt unnatural, deafening, as though the air itself had been sucked out. James gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white, his pulse still hammering like a frantic drumbeat in his chest. For a moment, he just sat there, staring at the house through the windshield. It stood in stark contrast to the serene suburban street around it, a festering wound in an otherwise picturesque neighborhood. The porch light flickered weakly, casting long, spidery shadows that seemed to crawl across the front yard. James's gaze was drawn to the basement window, a narrow slit of black glass partially obscured by overgrown weeds. His stomach turned as he thought he saw movement, a fleeting shadow, something shifting in the darkness. He blinked, and it was gone, but the unease remained, coiled tightly around him like a serpent. He started the car, the engine sputtering to life with a reluctant growl that felt unnervingly loud in the stillness. As the headlights illuminated the driveway, James noticed something he hadn't seen before. Footprints. They were faint but unmistakable. A trail of dark, wet marks leading from the front door to the driver's side of his car. His heart skipped a beat, a cold dread pooling in his stomach. He hadn't noticed them when he ran out. Had they been there all along, or... The thought was interrupted by a sudden sharp knock on the passenger window. James's head snapped toward the sound, his body tensing like a coiled spring. But there was nothing there. Just the empty street, bathed in the dim orange glow of a flickering street lamp. His breath caught in his throat, and his fingers tightened on the steering wheel. He scanned the mirrors, the back seat, the shadows beyond the car, his paranoia mounting with every passing second. The knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. He whipped his head around and his blood ran cold. The face pressed against the glass wasn't human. It was pale, almost translucent, with hollow eyes that seemed to bore into his soul. The mouth was twisted into a grotesque grin, rows of jagged teeth gleaming faintly in the dim light. James recoiled, his hand instinctively reaching for his sidearm, but when he blinked, the face was gone. The window was empty, save for a faint smudge where the skin had pressed against the glass. He sat frozen, his mind racing to rationalize what he had just seen. But no explanation came. The fear was raw, primal, coursing through his veins like ice water. He slammed his foot on the gas, the tires screeching as the car lurched forward. The house disappeared in the rearview mirror, swallowed by the darkness, but James couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. His eyes darted to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something lurking in the back seat. It was empty, but the tension didn't ease. The whispers had started again, faint and indistinct, barely audible over the hum of the engine. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, curling around him like smoke, filling the car with a suffocating sense of dread. The road stretched out before him, a winding ribbon of asphalt cutting through the dense forest that lined the outskirts of town. The trees loomed on either side like silent sentinels, their gnarled branches clawing at the night sky. The further he drove, the darker it seemed to get, the headlights barely penetrating the thick, oppressive blackness. His grip on the wheel tightened as the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They weren't random anymore. They were forming words, phrases. His name, James, you can't run. His breath hitched, his eyes darting to the radio as it crackled to life. Static filled the cabin, a harsh, grating sound that set his teeth on edge. And then, through the static, came the voice. Low and guttural, it spoke in a language he didn't understand, the words thick and heavy, like ancient stone grinding against metal. James's hands trembled, the car swerving slightly as he fought to stay in control. The voice grew louder, more commanding until it felt like it was inside his head, clawing at his thoughts, pulling him toward something he couldn't see. The car's headlights flickered, and for a moment, the road ahead was swallowed by darkness. When the light returned, James gasped. Standing in the middle of the road was a figure, a man, or what used to be one. His body was mangled, limbs bent at unnatural angles, his face a mask of agony. Blood dripped from his open wounds, pooling at his feet in a dark, viscous puddle. James slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt mere inches from the figure. But when he looked again, the road was empty. Panting, his heart racing, James rested his forehead against the steering wheel. His mind was unraveling, fraying at the edges like an old tattered rope. The whispers had stopped, the static gone, leaving only the sound of his ragged breathing and the faint ticking of the cooling engine. He sat there for what felt like hours, too afraid to move, too afraid to think. And then in the silence came the knock. This time it was on the windshield. Slow and deliberate, a hollow sound that sent shivers down his spine. He looked up, his blood running cold as he saw the word scrawled across the glass in thick, dripping letters. Confess. The air in the car grew heavier as James Holloway sat frozen, staring at the single damning word smeared across the windshield. Confess. The letters glistened like fresh blood, dripping slowly down the glass as though the word itself was alive, oozing malice. He could see his pale, horrified reflection in the streaks, distorted and trembling as he tried to process what was happening. His breathing quickened, fogging the interior, his chest rising and falling in shallow, desperate gasps. There was no rational explanation, no comforting logic to grasp onto. Something, someone, knew, as the word slowly disappeared, fading into the glass as if it had never existed. James's hands found the ignition again. He turned the key with a shaky determination, the engine sputtering to life with an almost reluctant growl. The momentary relief was short-lived. A low, guttural groan reverberated through the car's frame, not from the engine, but from somewhere inside. Beneath him, the sound was deep, inhuman, a vibration that seemed to resonate in his very bones. James stiffened, his pulse pounding in his ears as he glanced around the confined space. The mirrors showed nothing but darkness, the headlights illuminating only the barren road ahead, flanked by the skeletal trees that reached hungrily toward the sky. Yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was with him, lurking just beyond the edges of his vision. Every shadow seemed to shift. Every corner of the car felt alive, throbbing with an unseen presence that made his skin crawl. The leather seat beneath him felt uncomfortably warm now, as though something unseen had pressed against it moments before. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, the leather slick beneath his clammy palms, and pressed his foot down on the gas. The car lurched forward, its tires screeching against the asphalt as he sped down the winding road. The dark forest closed in around him, the trees blurring together in a nightmarish haze. The whispers started again. Faint at first, just a murmur beneath the hum of the engine, but they grew louder, more insistent, as if they were coming from inside the car. James, you can't hide. Confess. Confess. The voices overlapped, twisting together in a cacophony that seemed to seep into his mind, filling his thoughts with a suffocating dread. He gritted his teeth, his knuckles white as he clenched the wheel. But the voices only grew louder. They echoed off the interior walls of the car, bouncing around his skull, their words slithering into his ears like venomous snakes. He turned up the radio, hoping to drown them out, but all he got was static, a harsh, grating noise that seemed to mock his desperation. Then, through the static, came a familiar voice. It was his own. You can't run from this, James. You know what you've done. He slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a violent halt. The sudden jolt threw him forward, the seatbelt biting into his chest. His heart raced as he stared at the radio, the static still crackling faintly. He reached out with trembling fingers to turn it off, but the moment he touched the dial, the car's headlights flickered and died, plunging him into complete darkness. James sat frozen, his breath coming in short, panicked bursts. The silence was oppressive, the kind that presses against your ears and makes your heart thud louder just to fill the void. The only sound was the faint ticking of the cooling engine, a fragile reminder that the car was still there, still real. But the darkness around him felt alive, pulsating with an unseen menace. And then it began, a rhythmic tapping, faint but deliberate, against the rear window. James's body tensed, every nerve ending on fire as the sound grew louder, more forceful. He didn't want to look. He couldn't look. But the compulsion was overwhelming, an unbearable pressure that forced his head to turn. The rearview mirror showed nothing at first, just the same impenetrable blackness that surrounded the car. But as his eyes adjusted, he saw it. A face, pale and ghostly, with hollow, unblinking eyes that seemed to pierce through him. Its lips were stretched into a grotesque grin, teeth glinting faintly in the darkness. James's stomach churned, bile rising in his throat as the face began to press against the glass, the skin stretching unnaturally as though it were trying to push through. He slammed his hand against the horn, the blaring noise cutting through the night like a desperate scream. The face vanished, leaving only a faint fog on the window where it had been. But James didn't feel relief, only the growing certainty that it wasn't gone. It was inside now. He reached for his phone, his hands shaking so badly that he almost dropped it. The screen lit up, casting a dim, flickering light that barely illuminated the interior of the car. The battery icon flashed red, 3%. He opened the dial pad, his fingers fumbling to type 911, but before he could press call, the phone screen went black. James. The voice was right behind him now, low and guttural, dripping with malice. He whipped around, his flashlight trembling in his hand as he pointed it into the back seat. Nothing, just empty leather seats and shadows. But the air was heavy, suffocating, as though something unseen was pressing down on him. He could feel its presence, the cold, clammy sensation of breath against the back of his neck. The door locks clicked open one by one, the sound sharp and deliberate in the oppressive silence. James's chest tightened, his breath hitching as he gripped the steering wheel, paralyzed by fear. The passenger door creaked open slowly, the hinges groaning like a dying animal. Confess. The word came again, whispered directly into his ear, a sound so intimate and invasive it made his skin crawl. His vision blurred with tears as he bolted out of the car, stumbling onto the cold asphalt. The forest around him was silent, the kind of silence that feels unnatural, predatory. His legs felt like lead as he staggered forward, away from the car, his breath forming frantic clouds in the freezing air. Behind him, the car engine roared to life on its own. The headlights flared, illuminating the road ahead, but James didn't dare look back. He broke into a run, his footsteps pounding against the asphalt, the distant sound of tires screeching behind him like the howl of some monstrous beast. The whispers followed him into the woods, growing louder, closer, until they weren't whispers anymore. They were screams. The forest seemed alive as James stumbled into it, his breath ragged, his body trembling with exhaustion and terror. The trees were impossibly tall, their gnarled branches intertwining above him, forming a canopy so dense that it blocked out even the faintest trace of moonlight. He felt swallowed whole, as if he'd stepped into another world, one ruled not by natural order but by ancient, unknowable forces. The air was damp and heavy, carrying the earthy scent of decaying leaves and something else, something acrid, metallic, like the faint tang of blood. The whispers followed him, threading through the trees like spectral hands reaching for his soul. They weren't distant anymore. They were close, circling him, taunting him. They didn't echo. They vibrated, low and deep, resonating in his chest and making his heart pound harder. They spoke in fragmented sentences, a mix of words he couldn't understand and phrases he wished he couldn't. Lies. Buried deep. Confess. No escape. James tripped over a root, falling hard onto the forest floor. The impact knocked the wind out of him, and he gasped, clawing at the dirt as if it might anchor him in reality. His palms scraped against jagged rocks, the sting of torn skin sharp but grounding. For a moment he lay there, his cheek pressed against the cold earth, trying to steady his breathing. But the forest wouldn't let him rest. A rustling sound came from somewhere behind him, faint but deliberate, like footsteps crushing dry leaves. He froze, his entire body tensing as he strained to listen. The sound came again, closer this time, accompanied by a low, guttural growl. It wasn't human. The noise was wet and rattling, like something breathing through lungs full of liquid. Slowly, James lifted his head, his eyes darting toward the direction of the sound. The shadows between the trees shifted, forming shapes that didn't make sense. Too tall, too thin, their edges blurry, like a smudge on the edge of reality. He pushed himself up, his hands shaking, and stumbled forward, deeper into the forest. The ground beneath his feet was uneven, treacherous, littered with roots and hidden pitfalls that seemed to conspire against him. The whispers grew louder, overlapping with each step, until they weren't whispers at all, but a cacophony of voices shouting, screaming, accusing. "You think you can run? You think we don't see? Confess, James, confess before it's too late." His name echoed through the trees, spoken in voices he recognized, voices of people he'd known, people he'd hurt. His mother's soft, pleading tone, his father's gruff, disappointed growl, his ex-girlfriend's cold, cutting sneer. Each voice was a dagger, twisting deeper into his chest, dragging memories he'd buried long ago to the surface. He clapped his hands over his ears, trying to block them out, but it was useless. The voices were inside him now, crawling through his mind like worms in rotting wood. A sudden crack broke through the noise, sharp and unmistakable, the sound of a branch snapping underfoot. James spun around, his breath hitching, his eyes scanning the darkness. He saw nothing at first, just the endless expanse of trees and shadows, but then, in the distance, something moved. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but his panicked mind caught it. A figure, tall and lean, stepping out from behind a tree. The figure didn't move like a person. Its motions were jerky, unnatural, like a marionette being dragged forward by invisible strings. Its head tilted to one side, a sharp, angular movement that made James's stomach churn. The shadows clung to it, obscuring its features, but he could feel its gaze on him, piercing, unrelenting, filled with malice. James took a step back, his heel catching on a root. He stumbled but didn't fall, his body fueled by pure adrenaline. The figure took a step forward, and with that single movement, the air around James grew colder, the temperature plummeting so quickly that his breath turned to mist. His chest ached with the cold, his fingers numb as he turned and ran. The forest seemed to close in around him, the trees leaning closer, their branches clawing at his clothes and skin. Every step felt heavier, as though the ground itself was trying to pull him down, to swallow him whole. He could hear the figure behind him, its footsteps unnervingly slow but deliberate, as if it knew he couldn't escape. "James!" The voice was right behind him, low and guttural, dripping with venom. He didn't dare look back. He ran blindly, his vision blurred with tears, his lungs burning as he gasped for air. The forest blurred around him, the world tilting and spinning as panic took hold. He burst into a clearing, his momentum carrying him forward until he fell to his knees. The clearing was circular, unnaturally perfect, as though the trees had been deliberately carved away to create the space. In the center stood a single object, a mirror, tall and ornate, its frame carved from dark, twisted wood that seemed to writhe and pulse like something alive. The glass was cracked, the fractures spreading outward like a spider's web, but the surface was still reflective, still gleaming faintly in the darkness. James stared at the mirror, his breath hitching as a sense of overwhelming dread washed over him. He didn't want to approach it, didn't want to see what it might show him, but his feet moved on their own, carrying him closer, each step heavier than the last. When he finally stood before the mirror, he hesitated. His reflection blurred and distorted in the fractured glass. His heart pounded as he reached out, his fingers trembling, and touched the surface. It was cold, colder than ice, colder than death. The glass rippled beneath his touch, and suddenly the reflection changed. He saw himself, but not as he was. This version of him was pale and hollow-eyed, his skin stretched tight over his bones, his lips cracked and bleeding. And behind him, standing just over his shoulder, was the figure. James turned, his scream caught in his throat, but there was nothing there. When he looked back at the mirror, the reflection was gone. The glass was empty, showing only the clearing and the darkness beyond. But the voices returned, louder than ever, a chorus of rage and despair that shook the very ground beneath him. "Confess, James. Confess, or be consumed." The mirror cracked further, the fractures spreading until the entire surface shattered, the shards falling to the ground with a sound like distant thunder. But as the pieces hit the dirt, they didn't lie still. They moved, crawling toward him, reflecting distorted images of his face as they closed in. The last thing James saw before the darkness consumed him completely was his own terrified expression staring back at him from 1,000 tiny fragments. James awoke to darkness so profound it seemed to press against his skin, an oppressive void that swallowed all sense of direction. For a moment, he wasn't even sure if he was alive or dead. The air was thick, stifling, filled with the sharp tang of iron and the faint putrid stench of decay. He tried to sit up, but his body felt foreign, heavy as though it didn't belong to him anymore. His limbs trembled weakly, his fingers brushing against the cold, damp ground beneath him. Earth that felt wrong, too soft and yielding, as if it had been soaked through with something unspeakable. The silence around him was absolute, but not comforting. It was the kind of silence that brims with unseen menace, as though the very darkness was holding its breath, waiting for him to move. His heartbeat pounded in his ears, a frantic, irregular rhythm that felt deafening in the stillness. Slowly, cautiously, he reached out, his fingers searching blindly for some anchor, some point of reference. But the space around him was vast, endless, his hands meeting nothing but empty air and the faint chill of something unseen brushing past them. Then, from the depths of the void came a sound. It was faint at first, a low, rhythmic pulse, like the distant thud of a massive, unseen heartbeat. The sound was slow, deliberate, each beat reverberating through the ground, vibrating in his chest. James froze, his breath caught in his throat as the pulse grew louder, closer, until it was all-encompassing, a deafening, bone-shaking resonance that seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere at once. He scrambled to his feet, his legs weak and unsteady beneath him. The ground shifted unnaturally as he moved, like wet clay molding itself around his steps, holding him back. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but there was nowhere to go. The darkness was infinite, featureless, and the sound was inescapable, a relentless reminder of his vulnerability. "James." The voice was soft, almost gentle, but it carried a weight that crushed any sense of hope. It came from behind him, close enough that he could feel the breath on his neck, cold and damp, carrying the faint scent of rot. He spun around, his arms flailing in the void, but there was nothing there, just the darkness, watching, waiting. "Who's there?" he choked out, his voice hoarse, barely audible over the relentless pounding. The words echoed around him, distorted and fragmented, as though the void itself was mocking him. "Confess." The single word sliced through the darkness, sharp and commanding, spoken in a voice that wasn't human. It reverberated in his skull, a chorus of overlapping tones, some deep and guttural, others high and shrill. He clutched his head, his knees buckling as the sound threatened to split him apart. "I don't know what you want," he screamed, his voice breaking. "I haven't done anything." The darkness seemed to shift, to recoil slightly as though considering his words. The pounding heartbeat slowed, its rhythm becoming irregular, erratic. Then, without warning, the ground beneath him gave way. He fell, the sensation sudden and disorienting, the air rushing past him as he plummeted into the void. The fall seemed endless, his body weightless, his stomach lurching with every second. Around him, the darkness began to change, streaks of dim, flickering light cutting through the void like cracks in a blackened sky. The lights pulsed and twisted, forming fleeting images, faces contorted in agony, hands clawing at the edges of the cracks, mouths open in silent screams. James tried to close his eyes, but the images were burned into his mind, vivid and unrelenting. Each face seemed familiar yet unplaceable, their expressions filled with a pain so profound it made his chest ache. He wanted to scream, to beg for it to stop, but the air was ripped from his lungs as he fell faster, the lights around him growing brighter, more chaotic. Finally, with a bone-jarring impact, he hit solid ground. The force knocked the wind out of him, pain radiating through his body as he lay sprawled on the cold, unyielding surface. For a moment he couldn't move, every nerve ending screaming in protest as he struggled to catch his breath. When he finally opened his eyes, the darkness was gone. In its place was a vast, featureless expanse of white, so bright it burned his retinas. The ground beneath him was smooth and cold, like polished stone, stretching out infinitely in all directions. The air was eerily still, devoid of sound or movement, but James couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. He pushed himself to his knees, his body trembling as he scanned the horizon. In the distance, a figure began to take shape. It was small at first, a speck against the endless white, but it grew larger as it approached, its form shifting and flickering like a mirage. James's heart raced as the figure came into focus, revealing a tall, gaunt silhouette cloaked in shadows that seemed to writhe and pulse like living things. The figure stopped a few feet away, its presence oppressive, suffocating. James couldn't make out its face, but he could feel its gaze boring into him, cold and unrelenting. "You know why you're here," it said, its voice a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "You can't run from this." James shook his head, his hands gripping the ground as though it might keep him grounded. "I don't know what you're talking about," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The figure raised a hand, long and skeletal, its fingers ending in sharp, claw-like tips. With a slow, deliberate motion, it pointed at him. The white expanse around them darkened, the ground beneath James shifting into a swirling black abyss. From the depths of the abyss rose images, scenes from his past, fragmented and distorted, but unmistakable. He saw himself younger and full of arrogance, his hands stained with acts he'd tried so hard to forget. Lies told to those who trusted him, betrayals that left scars on others, even if they'd left none on him. And then, the moment he'd buried deepest, the flash of a blade, the sickening crunch of bone, and the silence that followed. "No," James whispered, his voice trembling as he tried to look away. "That wasn't me. I didn't." The figure stepped closer, the shadows around it reaching out like tendrils, wrapping around him and pulling him toward the abyss. "Confess," it demanded, its voice echoing through the void. "Confess, or be consumed." James screamed, his voice raw and desperate, as the abyss opened beneath him, pulling him into its endless depths. James's scream echoed into the nothingness, but the abyss swallowed it whole, silencing him as though his voice had never existed. The descent was relentless, dragging him deeper into a darkness that felt heavier than any he had ever known. This was no ordinary void. It pulsed with an unspoken malevolence, alive with whispers that didn't quite form words, but scraped against his mind like claws on brittle glass. Each whisper was a thought he didn't want to have, memories he didn't want to face, a cacophony of guilt and regret that twisted his soul. The air was cold, colder than anything natural, seeping into his bones and robbing him of breath. He reached out in desperation, his hands clawing at the nothingness around him, but there was no surface, no edge, no escape. Time lost all meaning. His fall felt eternal, his body weightless, but his mind unbearably heavy, as if every hidden truth he'd ever buried had been unearthed and placed on his chest, crushing him with its unbearable weight. Then, without warning, the descent stopped. His body collided with something hard and unyielding, the impact jarring as though he'd been thrown against stone. Pain radiated through him, sharp and searing, but it grounded him momentarily. He gasped, struggling to push himself up, his hands scraping against a rough, jagged surface that felt damp and sticky. The air here was different, thick, almost viscous, with a rancid smell that clawed at his throat and made him gag. The darkness around him shifted, no longer absolute. A faint, sickly glow began to seep into the space, emanating from the ground itself. It illuminated his surroundings in a pale, greenish hue, revealing a landscape that defied logic. He was in a cavern, its walls pulsing with a fleshy texture as if the place itself were alive. Veins of dark red coursed through the walls, pulsating in time with a deep rhythmic sound that reverberated through the air like a heartbeat. James stumbled to his feet, his legs shaky and weak, his eyes darting around in terror. The floor beneath him was slick and uneven, littered with sharp rocks and fragments of something that gleamed unnaturally in the dim light. He knelt to examine one, and his stomach twisted when he realized it wasn't a rock at all. It was a shard of bone, jagged and splintered, as if it had been wrenched from some unholy creature. "Where am I?" he whispered, his voice trembling, but no answer came. The silence was worse than the whispers. It felt alive, predatory, as though it were waiting for him to move, to make a mistake. As he staggered forward, the cavern seemed to shift around him, its walls narrowing and expanding, closing in and then pulling away, as though it were breathing. He could hear faint noises now, low and guttural, like the growls of some immense unseen beast lurking just beyond the edge of his vision. He tried to focus, but the dim light played tricks on his mind, casting shadows that flickered and danced in shapes that made no sense. He rounded a corner and froze. Ahead of him was a figure, standing motionless in the center of the cavern. It was cloaked in shadow, its form indistinct, but its presence was undeniable, a crushing, suffocating weight that made James's knees buckle. He tried to speak, to call out, but his throat closed, and all he could do was stare. The figure turned, its movements slow and deliberate, and James felt his heart stop. Its face, or what passed for a face, was a swirling mass of darkness, featureless and yet somehow expressive. It didn't have eyes, but he could feel its gaze piercing him, stripping away every layer of pretense and exposing the raw, trembling core of his being. "James," it said, and its voice was a chorus, dozens of tones layered atop one another, each one familiar yet alien, like a reflection in a shattered mirror. "Do you know why you're here?" James shook his head frantically, his breath coming in shallow gasps. I don't understand," he stammered, his voice barely audible over the pounding in his ears. The figure stepped closer, and with each movement the air grew heavier, pressing down on him like a physical force. "Lies," it hissed, the word cutting through him like a blade. "You've always known, you've run from it, buried it, but the truth cannot be escaped." The cavern around them began to change, the walls shifting and warping, forming grotesque shapes that seemed to mock him. Faces appeared in the flesh-like surface, their mouths twisted into screams, their eyes wide with terror. He recognized them, every one of them. They were people from his past, people he'd hurt, people he'd betrayed. "No," he whispered, backing away, his hands trembling as he clutched his head. "This isn't real. This isn't real." The figure's laughter echoed through the cavern, a sound so cold and hollow it made his blood run cold. Reality is subjective, James, but the pain, the guilt, that is eternal. Suddenly the ground beneath him began to shift, the bone fragments rising and twisting, forming grotesque shapes that clawed at his legs, pulling him down. He struggled, kicking and thrashing, but the more he fought, the tighter their grip became. The walls of the cavern pulsed faster now, the rhythmic heartbeat speeding up, growing louder and louder until it was deafening. The figure loomed over him, its shadow stretching impossibly far, engulfing him in darkness once more. "Confess," it demanded, its voice resonating in his very bones. "Confess, and perhaps you will find peace." Tears streamed down James's face as he shook his head. "I don't know what you want from me," he screamed, his voice raw with desperation. The figure knelt, its featureless face inches from his own. "You do," it said. And in that moment, James's mind shattered. Memories flooded back, unbidden and unstoppable, each one more horrifying than the last. The lies, the betrayals, the blood on his hands, all of it laid bare, undeniable. He screamed, a sound of pure anguish, as the cavern collapsed around him, the walls closing in, the faces screaming in unison. The figure remained still, its presence unyielding, as James was consumed by the weight of his sins. James's consciousness teetered on the edge of oblivion, the cavern's oppressive darkness threatening to consume the last shred of his sanity. The suffocating heartbeat-like thrum filled every corner of his mind, synchronized with his own racing pulse, until it felt as though the two beats might merge into one unbearable rhythm. He lay sprawled on the damp, fleshy floor, trembling as he tried to catch his breath. His body ached, each nerve firing in protest against the nightmare that surrounded him. Yet as horrifying as the place was, it was the figure's words that echoed louder than anything else. "You do." The air around him was thick with tension, as though the cavern itself hungered for his next move. Every shallow inhale filled his lungs with the sickly sweet stench of decay, a clawing reminder of the countless atrocities buried within this living tomb. He clawed at the ground in an attempt to pull himself up, his nails scraping against the slick surface that seemed to shift under his touch. The walls pulsed in time with the relentless rhythm, their fleshy texture glistening in the faint, otherworldly glow that bathed the cavern in a sickly green hue. And then, without warning, the ground beneath him convulsed violently, throwing him onto his back. A low, guttural groan reverberated through the chamber, a sound that was both alien and disturbingly human. James's head snapped toward the source and his heart plummeted. One of the walls had begun to shift, its surface bulging outward as though something massive was trying to push through. The fleshy texture rippled and stretched, forming grotesque shapes that writhed and twisted in the dim light. A hand emerged first, if it could even be called a hand. Its skeletal frame was draped in sinewy, translucent flesh that glistened wetly, the fingers unnaturally long and tipped with jagged claws that seemed to gleam with malice. The hand clawed at the air, followed by an arm, then a shoulder, until an entire figure tore itself free from the wall. It was tall, impossibly tall. Its grotesque frame hunched to fit within the cavern. Its face, or lack thereof, was a nightmare-given form. A blank expanse of skin stretched taut over a misshapen skull, its features indistinct and ever-shifting, as though it couldn't decide what form to take. James scrambled backward, his hands slipping on the slick ground as his panicked breathing turned into shallow, desperate gasps. The creature tilted its head toward him, the motions slow and deliberate, like a predator sizing up its prey. Its blank face began to ripple, and as James stared in horrified fascination, it began to take on a new shape. A shape he recognized all too well. It was his own face. The sight struck him like a physical blow, and for a moment all he could do was stare. The creature's new visage was a grotesque parody of his own, its features exaggerated and twisted into a mockery of humanity. The eyes were too wide, the mouth stretched into an impossibly broad grin that revealed rows of jagged, blood-stained teeth. When it spoke, its voice was a distorted echo of his own, layered with countless other tones that created a symphony of terror. "You can't hide from yourself, James," it rasped, each word dripping with venom. "You've built your life on lies, on betrayal. You've left a trail of ruin behind you, and now it's time to face the consequences." The creature took a step forward, its claws clicking against the ground with an almost rhythmic precision. James tried to push himself away, but his limbs felt heavy, as though the cavern itself were holding him down. His mind raced, fragments of memories flashing before his eyes, moments he had tried so hard to forget. A child's cry, a blood-stained floor, a door slammed shut. "No!" he choked out, his voice barely a whisper. That's not true." The creature's laughter was a low, guttural sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once, reverberating through the cavern like a thunderclap. "You've lied so well, James, even to yourself. But the truth has a way of surfacing, doesn't it?" As the creature advanced, the cavern began to shift once more. The walls rippled and groaned, and the grotesque faces that had been etched into their surface began to emerge fully, their forms twisting and writhing as they pulled themselves free. Dozens of figures now surrounded him, each one a horrifying blend of the familiar and the monstrous. Their faces were distorted, but their eyes, those hollow, accusing eyes, were unmistakable. James recognized them all. They were the people he had wronged, their faces etched into his memory like scars. Some were family, others friends, but all bore the same expression of betrayal and sorrow. They didn't speak, but their presence was louder than any scream, a silent condemnation that pierced him to his core. "Why are you doing this to me?" he cried, his voice breaking as tears streamed down his face. "I didn't mean to. I didn't." The creature loomed over him now, its grotesque grin widening as it knelt to meet his gaze. "You didn't mean to?" it mocked, its voice a cruel whisper. "Intentions mean nothing, James. Actions do, and your actions have led you here, to this moment. There is no escape, no redemption, only the truth." As it spoke, the cavern began to close in around him, the walls pressing closer, the figures advancing, their hollow eyes fixed on him with an intensity that burned. James could feel the weight of their judgment, their pain, their anger. It was suffocating, crushing him from the inside out. He screamed, a sound of pure anguish and terror, but the cavern swallowed it whole. The creature reached out, its claws inches from his face, and James's mind fractured under the weight of the horrors he could no longer deny. The truth, once buried, now consumed him, leaving nothing but a hollow shell in its wake. James lay sprawled on the quivering floor, his chest heaving with shallow, desperate breaths. The cavern seemed to pulsate around him, a living, breathing entity that fed off his terror. The heartbeat-like thrum in the air had grown deafening, sinking with the erratic pounding in his chest until it felt as though the cavern itself was inside him, dictating his very existence. His limbs felt leaden, each movement requiring a monumental effort, as though an unseen force pressed him into the fleshy ground, denying him even the illusion of freedom. The figures circling him had grown closer, their grotesque faces and distorted bodies towering over him. The silence between them was maddening. They stared at him with eyes that glowed faintly in the sickly green light, their gazes filled with something far worse than anger. It was a knowing look, a silent accusation that cut deeper than any scream could have. Their twisted mouths moved in unison, forming words that were never spoken, yet James could hear them inside his skull, as clear as if they were his own thoughts. "You did this." He clamped his hands over his ears, desperate to drown out the sound, but it was futile. The voices weren't external. They resonated deep within him, burrowing into his mind and unraveling his sanity thread by thread. Each accusation brought with it a flood of memories, vivid and inescapable. He saw himself as a child, lying to his parents to avoid punishment. He saw the first betrayal, the first time he turned his back on someone who trusted him. Each act was like a drop of poison, small and inconsequential on its own, but together they had festered into the grotesque reality that now surrounded him. The air grew colder, each breath forming visible plumes that quickly dissipated into the oppressive darkness. The creature that bore his face, his distorted, hideous mirror, stepped closer, its elongated limbs moving with a sickening grace. Every step it took seemed to reverberate through the cavern, the sound wet and crunching, as though the ground itself were alive and suffering beneath its weight. Its grin widened impossibly, splitting its face in two, revealing rows of jagged, yellowed teeth that dripped with a black, viscous liquid. "Do you see now, James?" it hissed, its voice a cacophony of overlapping tones, each one laced with malice. "Do you understand what you are?" James shook his head violently, his hands trembling as he tried to push himself away from the creature. "No," he croaked, his voice hoarse and barely audible. "This isn't me. I didn't. Please." The creature laughed, a sound so cold and hollow it seemed to drain the very light from the air. "You've always been so good at lying, haven't you? Even to yourself. But lies have a way of unraveling, James, and now there's nothing left but the truth." As it spoke, the cavern began to shift once more. The walls, already grotesque and pulsating, seemed to peel away like decayed flesh, revealing something far more horrifying beneath. Mirrors. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of mirrors, embedded into the very fabric of the cavern. Their surfaces were warped and cracked, but each one reflected a version of James, each one more grotesque than the last. He turned away, his stomach churning, but the mirrors were everywhere. No matter where he looked, he couldn't escape his own image. And as he stared, horrified, the reflections began to move on their own, independent of his actions. They twisted and contorted, their faces stretching into masks of agony and despair. Some wept black tears that streaked their distorted features, while others clawed at the glass, their mouths open in silent screams. "No," James whimpered, his voice trembling. "This isn't real. This can't be real." The creature loomed over him, its shadow stretching impossibly far, engulfing him in darkness once more. "Reality is what you've made it, James," it said, its voice a venomous whisper. "And now, you must face it." The mirrors began to ripple, their surfaces shifting like water, and James's reflection in each one changed again. This time, they showed him moments from his life, but not as he remembered them. They showed the consequences of his actions, the ripple effects of every lie, every betrayal, every selfish decision. He saw faces he had long since forgotten, faces twisted in pain and sorrow. He saw a woman sobbing in an empty apartment, a child clutching a blood-stained toy, a man staring into the void with hollow eyes. "Stop," he begged, tears streaming down his face. "Please, stop." But the mirrors didn't stop. They multiplied, their images growing more vivid, more brutal. He saw things he had never witnessed but knew to be true. The lives he had destroyed, the people he had abandoned. The weight of their pain pressed down on him, suffocating him until he could barely breathe. The creature knelt beside him, its grotesque face inches from his own. "You've built your life on the suffering of others," it said, its voice soft but cutting. "Did you think there would be no reckoning, no cost to be paid?" James couldn't answer. His throat was dry, his mind a whirlwind of terror and regret. He wanted to deny it, to scream that it wasn't true, but the evidence surrounded him, undeniable and unrelenting. The cavern was a prison, and the only escape lay in the one thing he had avoided his entire life: the truth. The mirrors began to crack, one by one, the sound sharp and piercing. Shards fell to the ground, each one gleaming like a jagged tooth, and where the mirrors had been, new horrors emerged. Figures crawled out of the void, their forms shifting and incomplete, as though they were trapped between realities. They moved toward him with a purpose, their hollow eyes fixed on him, their clawed hands outstretched. James screamed, his voice raw and desperate, but the figures didn't stop. They surrounded him, their cold hands grasping at his arms, his legs, his face. Their touch burned like ice, sending waves of pain through his body. They pulled him toward the largest mirror, its surface still intact, its reflection showing not him, but the creature. "Look," the creature commanded, its voice thunderous. "Look and see what you truly are." James was forced to face the mirror, his own reflection replaced by the monster's hideous visage. As he stared into its hollow eyes, he felt something break inside him, a dam of denial that had held back the truth for so long. Memories flooded him, each one more horrifying than the last, until he could no longer tell where the past ended and the nightmare began. The creature's laughter filled the cavern as James fell to his knees, broken and defeated, The truth was a weight he could no longer bear, and as the mirror's surface began to ripple and twist, he realized with dawning horror that there was no escape. James's body trembled uncontrollably, his legs betraying him as he collapsed into the cold, damp floor. The sound of his breath, shallow, frantic, was the only noise in the suffocating darkness. The shadows stretched across the vast, endless cavern, their shapes indistinct yet filled with a presence that made the air heavy with dread. There were no longer any reflections, no more mirrors that offered the illusion of normalcy. The creature that had once mimicked his own face now stood behind him, its towering form casting a long, sinister. Each footstep that James attempted to take felt like a futile movement, as if the very ground beneath him was holding him captive. His body, a shell of his former self, had become a prison, battered by the horrors he'd endured, and the promises of escape he once clung to now felt as distant and unattainable as a fading dream. His mind, too, had been reduced to a fractured web of broken thoughts, each one a jagged piece of something that had once been whole. The whispers, the cacophony of voices that had haunted him since he'd first stepped into this forsaken place, grew louder. Now they no longer spoke to him. They spoke through him. He could feel them inside his mind, burrowing deeper with every passing second, consuming whatever remnants of his sanity remained. You know what you did? You know it all. The lies, the betrayals, the blood on your hands. The voice was not his own, yet it felt as though it had always been a part of him, waiting for this very moment to emerge. He screamed, a raw, guttural sound that echoed through the cavern like the cry of an animal in the grip of its final moments. But no one was there to hear him. No one ever had been. His cries were swallowed by the suffocating, oppressive darkness that pressed in from all sides. The shadows, now tangible, seemed to encircle him like the coils of a serpent, squeezing the life from him with slow, deliberate force. As his vision blurred, he caught sight of something, or rather, someone, moving at the edge of his perception. His heart raced, a wild pulse of dread that tore through his chest. There was no mistake. It was her, the woman from his past, the one whose life he had ruined without a second thought. She had been here all along, a shadow, a specter woven into the fabric of this cursed place. Her face, twisted with grief and anger, mirrored the agony that churned inside him. She had never truly left him. Her image had been embedded in his soul, just as the others had. Faces of the innocent, faces of those he had cast aside without a second glance. He could feel them now, their spirits, their suffering, pressing against him like a suffocating weight, binding him to the consequences of his actions. "Please, I didn't mean to." His voice cracked as he whispered to the empty air, his words feeble and broken. The truth, the undeniable truth, had finally come crashing down on him. The lies, the manipulation, the self-serving actions that had led him to this point, there was no escaping them now. They were as much a part of him as the very blood in his veins. The shadows, hungry and relentless, closed in tighter, as if feeding off his confession. He could feel their touch on his skin now. Cold, clammy hands that dragged across his face, pulling his features into grotesque contortions. They whispered his name, over and over, a chant that seemed to reverberate through every fiber of his being, until it became the only sound in the universe. He couldn't escape it. He couldn't even move. "You will never escape." The voice of the creature behind him rasped, its tone full of finality. "You will face the consequences of your actions, forever." The cavern trembled once again, the walls shaking as if the very earth itself were in pain. The ground split open in jagged, gaping cracks, and from within those fissures, dark figures emerged, torn and shattered souls who had long since succumbed to the horrors of this place. They reached for him, their hands clawing at the air, desperate to pull him into the abyss with them. He could hear them now, their voices, the sounds of their torment, the cries of those he had wronged. Each whisper, each plea, each scream gnawed at his mind, stripping him bare of any sense of hope, of humanity. He tried to scream again, but the words caught in his throat, suffocated by the weight of his guilt and terror. His body jerked violently as the shadows converged on him, pulling him into the dark, into the endless pit that lay just beyond the reach of the light. He felt his flesh tear, his bones snap, his mind breaking into 1,000 pieces, each one scattering into the darkness. There was no salvation, no redemption. There was only the weight of the past, the weight of everything he had ever done. And then the darkness consumed him. If you enjoyed this story and want more terrifying tales, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. Now, a question to keep you up tonight. What if the whispers you hear in the dark aren't in your head?